In essence, what you're asking is how do we balance the need for progress with the desire for fairness? In the large scale, where teenage rebelliousness comes from is there's a gap between the age at which teenagers realize that the world is not as fair and as well run and as sorted out as the adults told you when you were a child. So there's a certain age where you realize that, and then you get mad. You get mad at your parents because they didn't fix these problems. And then there's another age where you sort of grow up all the way and you realize that these problems don't exist because of the lack of the political will to solve them. They exist because these problems are hard and nobody has figured out how to solve them. So I think initiatives like DEI, these conscious sort of government programs that are sold as we're going to make the world fair, they exist in that space where it's like we realize the world has problems, but we think those problems exist because nobody gives a shit, as opposed to those problems exist because nobody's figured out how to do it. And I think the best way that you can make life better for the people who are worst off is to build better technology and make life better for everybody.
Hey guys, welcome back to Demystify Sci. Today we have a conversation with sci-fi author Devon Eriksen. And we found Devon because he reached out to us through Twitter and is the author of a recent book called Theft of Fire. And the book explores all of these questions about the future of the human species and artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and rocketry technology that's going to allow us to expand to the stars, with a slight twist on what most of modern sci-fi is, which is really dystopian. And Devon's whole point is he's like, yo, I grew up reading all of these really optimistic, hopeful books about what it was going to be like for humans to continue pressing on this accelerator of exploration, to go out to the stars, to make ourselves a multiplanetary species. And then I discovered that most of modern sci-fi is really wrapped up in this idea of dystopian futures. It's all about how we're just screwed. And so he wanted to write something that contradicted that and painted a portrait of a possible future for humanity that threw back to classical sci-fi, which is optimistic and hopeful and paints a picture of progress that does not destroy the human spirit, but instead nurtures it.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally about frontiers, this discussion. And so we've had countless academics on the show that are basically all but making the point that we shouldn't explore space because, hey, Earth's really screwed up. And this gentleman has been one of the few people who's come out to the program and said, I actually think Earth is way less screwed up than it's ever been. And we have nothing to lose and everything to gain from exploring the stars, mining the asteroids, and raising the water level for everybody on this ship. So that's kind of interesting. And it gets contentious at some points, which was kind of fun. I think that he mistook us for hardcore liberal academics, but we're really just trying to understand how things work at the end of the day.
And honestly, I love when conversations get contentious. I feel like we tend to on the show be very mild, but that does not actually reflect our native proclivities. And so it's really nice to have somebody come by who's like, no, I'm just agreeable enough that we can actually hash all this out. So it was really, really fun.
Yeah, we actually had a pre-show this morning with a guy who was like, no, please, you need to find something wrong with my theory. I'm so bored of going on podcasts and telling this to people who just nod their heads. So anyways, we aim to please. But remember, the show's entirely sponsored by you guys directly through patreon.com. And we, together with our patrons every week, hang out, explore the universe, figure out what we should tackle next as far as investigations of the universe. And I'd love to see you there too. So come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and consider just giving a couple dollars a month to keep this place ad-free, keep it without sponsors, selling junk. We just want to be paid for by the people who love the show. So check it out.
And also,
go ahead.
And also check out Devon's book, Theft of Fire. It's available wherever it is that you shop for books. There's a link in the description. and enjoy the conversation. We'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Decay podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Well, I began life as the son of one of the lead engineers on the Voyager project from JPL. So when I was a very small child, about once a year or so, I would be at the Voyager press conferences, sometimes watching these pictures of the outer planets come up in real time. So space exploration sort of loomed very large in my childhood psyche. And I had these ideas that, okay, someday we're going to go there. We're going to look at this with our own eyes. We're going to go out there and see this. And of course, I was hugely fascinated by science fiction. Spent a good part of my young life in the back of the stacks at some public library with a pile of science fiction books as high as my head. You know, the classic golden age stuff, as well as the 70s and 80s kind of science fiction. And it was all very forward looking. It was very hopeful about the future, not really in the sense that the stories were utopian or that everything was nice in them, but in the sense that there was this general consensus that humanity would ascend, that the future of our species involved spreading further and having a better understanding of nature and having more power over the universe and over our lives. And I noticed as I got older, and by this time I was working as an engineer in various capacities, again, the science and engineering stuff, I noticed that a lot of the science fiction sort of got replaced with this kind of dystopian visions of the future and these kind of post-apocalyptic visions of the future, where this vision of what you would be doing in the future was no longer, oh, you're going to be traveling between the stars and, you know, seeing sights on distant worlds. What you're going to be doing is fighting off the radioactive cannibals with a sharpened piece of rebar.
Or even
And
worse, just getting orphaned by your technology. Like, I feel like
yeah,
Black Mirror is kind of the
yeah,
epitome of that vision of the
yeah,
sci-fi dystopia.
oh yes, it's this sort of very much this kind of degrowth agenda science fiction where, you know, technology is bad and we need to return to the past. And I didn't agree with that. I wasn't done with stories about technological futures. I wasn't done with the ascent of man. And so at a certain point, the certain point being, okay, I'm retired from software engineering. I can spend my days doing what I want. I said, well, okay, fine. I'll do it myself. So I rolled up my sleeves and I did it myself. And I wrote the kind of science fiction that I wanted to read, which was classic 20th century science fiction, updated with new ideas about what the technology of the future is actually going to be like. So it very much borrows from that tradition of Heinlein and Asimov and Niven and maybe William Gibson's Neuromancer, and just takes that kind of aesthetic, that kind of story, that kind of character interaction, and says, okay, what if we write one of these kinds of stories with our new and updated ideas about how our technology is going to progress? And that's what I came up with. And I kind of based it on the three areas that I really think will shape the future in a big way. And one of them is rocketry and space travel, really leaving Earth's gravity well and colonizing the solar system. And then the second is biotech, shaping other organisms and ourselves, human genetic engineering. And the last one is artificial intelligence, both in the sense that we mean it today and in the more distant future, what we might call a hard artificial intelligence, in the sense that we create something that is what we would call a sentient artificial life form.
Embodied.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of places that we can go to from there. How much of the story are you interested in talking about on air? Because I know that as somebody who's written a book, you don't want to give too much of the story away, and so I want to be careful to not,
Well,
spoilers.
I can talk about themes and stuff, and I can talk about pieces of technology that are in it. And there's a character who doesn't show up until later in the story, but she's on the cover. So I think talking about the artificial intelligence angle doesn't really spoil too much. So long as we stay away from specific events, I think we'll be fine.
So the story is basically there's a guy who owns a mining ship. His ship gets commandeered by this genetically engineered character who comes from a very wealthy lineage.
Yeah.
And then they're off on this caper to the far reaches of the solar system where there is this thing that needs to be recovered, discovered, uncovered,
It's a
whatever you want to
treasure
say.
hunt. It's a treasure hunt. He gets his ship hijacked by someone who wants to retrieve something and doesn't want anybody else to know about it. And he's like, I don't want to go on the treasure hunt. And so he fights back, and he fights back very effectively.
It's interesting because she kind of represents, to me, at least my readers, she represents this transhumanist future where people are designing their own bodies and all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And the main character isn't particularly fond of that whole story. So is there some preservation of a critique there as well?
Well, as Larry Niven, who was had a famously abrasive way of talking about things. He liked to say,
I don't actually know who
that
Larry Niven is.
he wrote Ringworld.
We're not big enough science fiction nerds,
Yeah, I
unfortunately.
mean, like I grew up on
Okay.
like
Too much
Heinlein
science, not
and
enough
Philip
fiction.
K. Dick and Arthur
Okay.
C. Clarke, but at some
Okay,
point,
well, he was a little bit after them, sort of in the 70s and 80s. And he's still writing stuff today. It's very good stuff. But his way of putting it was, we have a technical literary term for readers who assume the opinions of characters are the opinions of authors. We call them idiots. I wouldn't quite go that far, but I would say that it is definitely poor writing if your characters are just your mouthpiece and they agree with you about everything. So
I guess I wasn't really trying to say that. I wasn't necessarily asking if that was your opinion, but does seem to be a tension that you play with, right? That's like a real tension in the universe.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fight on both sides, right? It seems like.
Well, I wanted to create a future that was not sort of just like utopian, because that's boring and it's unrealistic. People will still be people in the future, and they will still have differences of opinions, and these will still lead to conflicts, and these will still lead to problems. So you have a character who is, because of his history, is very skeptical of the privileges of wealth. And you have a society which is much more wealthy and allows people to spend the modern equivalent of $15 to $20 million genetically engineering their children. And the story, in a sense, where it starts, you have these two characters encountering and profoundly misunderstanding each other. And so there's definitely a lot of the forces of their own preconceptions at play.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So A lot of these forces and these preconceptions are just taking the events that are already taking place on Earth today and expanding them outward to a vision of the world where everything that is already happening, we have pressed on the accelerator and the divides have gotten to be even greater and are now baked into the foundational reality of bodies, right? Because you have this guy he's not a belter, the main character, right?
Well, he sort of is. It's his adapted culture.
But he's not, because like the belters are physiologically different from him.
Yeah, they're physiologically different due to being raised in microgravity. I went with the assumption that human beings would be significantly taller if they grew up in very, very low gravity environments. And he kind of adopted into this culture as a teenager. And so he's physiologically not quite that way. But he's very, very keen on Belter culture because, as we know, there's no fanatic like a convert.
Mm. And so is he from Earth originally?
He grew up in the Marburg habitat on Venus.
I see. Okay, so he's basically representative, as far as I can tell. There's the conflict between two of the characters is a socioeconomic conflict that's already on Earth today. But we
Well,
haven't gotten to the point of genetic engineering
uh,
and full-bore transhumanism,
uh,
where you have lineages and you have castes. Like one of the most interesting findings related to this is a few years ago, there's this thing floating around on Twitter where somebody had published an analysis of the families that were in power in China prior to the Cultural Revolution, and showed that despite the fact that they were destroyed and really knocked back during the Cultural Revolution, after Maoist China declined, those same families again rose to prominence.
yes.
And so there's already this thing that's baked into lineages that maintain power and influence and a hold over culture. But in the world that you've written, it's the gasoline has been poured on that fire.
Well, I'm not sure I would necessarily characterize it as a fire. Um, you can see an effect throughout history where people who have high IQ and high agency, and this tends to run in families both genetically and culturally, um, are going to be better able to leverage opportunities that are available to them. But one thing to remember about this particular portrait of society is that you're looking at a frontier culture in the sense of, there were literally a frontier maybe a couple of decades or 50 years ago or what have you, and still very much a frontier culture, even though life has become more comfortable. So Earth's gravity well is extremely difficult to get out of. I'm sure I need not lecture you on the specifics. But that, in a sense, in the future, will serve as a filter function in the colonization of space. So you're not going to see a lot of people out in space who are not both capable and driven. And so while Marcus may characterize himself as one of the have-nots, that is sort of a skewed perception because the bar has been moved. As Miranda points out at one point, your father owned this asteroid mining company. You're not exactly one of the underclass here. And so one of the things that this points out is that as technology advances and as both our tech stack and our economies becomes more powerful, the definition of poverty changes.
Hmm.
I think that a lot of the people we characterize as have-nots today are living in sort of conditions of what would be considered ludicrous wealth by even the nobles of the medieval period. As someone commented on one of my Twitter posts not too long ago, you know, we could have we could have a machine that that feeds fresh sliced tropical fruit into your mouth, and everybody could have this, and they would still describe themselves as poor. And you would point this out, and they'd say, "Well, yes, that's just the auto feeder. Everybody has those. Have you seen the cost of Holo Worlds lately?"
Yeah, there's
So,
definitely a sliding scale for that.
yeah. So
But
one of the points here in the book, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'll keep this short. Is that is that the this rising tide lifts all boats, and so we have this human perception of these, Marcus sort of grousing about things in a universe which is very much advanced over our own.
take it away, Delay.
Well, I mean, is it worth addressing things like parts of the frontier culture, like, say, the abuse of immigrant labor? And is there a place for that in the future? Do you think that these mining companies will just continue doing the abysmal mining practices that they do in the Congo right now, or something like that?
Well, I think I think one has to understand that mining becomes a whole different thing when you get into space, because we may still call it mining, but it's a completely different process. Um, because when we look at our tech stack today and our raw material supply chain today, we have to understand that from the perspective of the solar system as a whole, we are actually living in an environment that is extremely poor in heavy elements. And Earth is, as we've said, a gravity well. It's a very steep gravity well. And the thing about making this very deep well and pouring a whole bunch of elements into it is that all the heavy stuff sinks to the bottom. And so all of the real high concentrations of the interesting elements that we use in technology are mostly concentrated at the core of the Earth, where we can't get them. And we're just kind of scratching around at the surface. And so this means that we often have to go to places in the third world and use these kinds of labor-intensive techniques that create these very, very harsh conditions, because we're trying to extract these heavy elements to feed a very sophisticated industrial machine that needs a lot of this stuff. Well, if you go outside this gravity well, then you have a bunch of chunks of rock floating around in space that are not very big and not creating a very deep gravity well. So all the interesting elements are in the surface. And you can just kind of fly up to one of these things, start cutting it up, and start firing chunks of good stuff back at the inner planets. And what this represents is this sort of vast entrepreneurial opportunity for anyone who has a spacecraft and the ability to cut stuff up, to go out there, find one of these floating pieces of extremely valuable ore and start making a living or even a fortune for themselves. And there's one scene late in the book, and I won't spoil the circumstances, but somebody's loading a rifle, and he observes that he's loading it with frangible bullets that won't damage the hull, which are different than an ordinary bullet, which is just a lump of gold. And the reader is supposed to scratch his head just for a moment of this and say, gold? Yeah, well, gold is so cheap, they're using it for bullets now. And if we look at the value of asteroids in today's dollars, at today's level of mineral scarcity, there is one asteroid out there we've found which is worth $55 quadrillion.
Is that Psyche?
I keep wanting to say Psyche, but I kind of remember when I did the research, it was maybe another one. So it's like it's one of them. Don't quote me on that. Maybe
But
it's
yeah, I mean,
Psyche.
like
Yeah,
there's tons of gold in space. There's diamonds. You have this
yeah,
scene early in the book where he's
yeah,
describing the process of space mining, and he's
yeah,
talking about how the drill bits continuously get fouled on these gigantic diamonds, and what they do with
yeah.
the diamonds is they
16
just dig them
Psyche, I
out
guess.
and they just throw them away.
Chuck them into space. Yeah, because
Is it
they're
Psyche?
yeah.
Yeah, 16 Psyche.
It's supposed to
Yeah.
be 10,000 quadrillion.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
I mean,
obviously that is worth more than the entire Earth economy. But of course, what you fire this thing back to Earth orbit and you start stripping it, you don't actually get 10,000 quadrillion dollars. What you get is a massive drop in the prices of all these things that are right now serving as a bottleneck in Earth's tech stack.
I mean, last
So,
time I talked to one of these minor people that are working on these projects, they were trying to say that you couldn't actually bring it back to Earth.
Dennis Wingo, are you thinking of?
Maybe I've talked to a few people about this,
mhm.
but they were saying that all of these ores would be used for further projects in space, something like that, because the idea of bringing it back is very, very expensive in and of itself, like getting it through the atmosphere, essentially.
Well, oh yeah, yeah. Well, you have to consider you have to start from considering what it would cost in terms of today's money and what it would and thinking about what it would cost when you have developed these future technologies. So people who are heavily focused on economics tend to be very pessimistic about future technology because it's very hard to have that detailed economic understanding of today and to still keep your finger on the pulse of how fast technology advances and how everything, including like electricity and running water, starts as a luxury for the wealthy, and then we figure out ways to do it cheaper. But there's another angle to this, and that's, would we necessarily bring it all back to Earth? Well, no, because there's no good reason. Once we have habitat out there, once we have human expertise, say, on Mars, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a lot of your industry located on Earth
Hmm.
because you have to get all the
That's
stuff.
where
Yeah.
you end up with the hellscape factory on Mars. That's, you can't go outside because the radiation's so bad, and you import cheap labor there, and it just turns into like a slave colony or something. That's the nightmare dystopian version of that, I suppose.
Yeah, you seem very keen on this idea that
Well,
everything
I'll tell you
slavery.
well, to tell you the truth, I believe we do need to branch out and explore space. I just don't want to bring all of the ugly pieces of our own industrial processes with us, or the frictions that come from that. I wonder, because frontier culture has been pretty ugly in the past in many ways. Imperialism's obviously been ugly in many ways. That's not to say that we don't benefit from it enormously, or that I'm not interested in continuing to discover the universe and live
Well,
and back up the planet.
I think when we consider the ugliness of imperialism, we need to consider the ugliness of the alternatives as well. We need to think of everything in terms of its opportunity cost. So, one of the things that I think, science fiction is in an ideal place to sort of point out and explore is the way that culture is downstream from technology. So often the social conditions on the ground are really dictated by the demands of the technology rather than by the social consciousness of the individuals participating. Their social attitudes tend to adapt to what the technology demands. And often you'll see these cases where um, there's an advance and it will make things worse in the short run and better in the long run. And we saw that with the Industrial Revolution, where we had all of a sudden now we have this ability to manufacture things at scale. And obviously that's going to make the world enormously better in the future. But in the process, we tend to, at first we sort of blew a lot of soot into the atmosphere and gave people lung diseases because we didn't understand the hazards thereof. And we put a lot of children to work on those machines, and it wasn't a very nice condition to live in. And, we need to understand the same thing about, what we sometimes pejoratively refer to as imperialism, where these very technologically successful and technologically and financially successful societies did, started to expand their influence into resource-rich but technology-poor areas. And what that eventually did was create the modern technological world that we live in very comfortably. And in fact, this is the long-term effects of this kind of capitalism have actually lifted a lot of inhabitants of the third world out of poverty to the point where, poverty is now a minority position in the world as opposed to being the default. But of course, then we had this sort of transitional period where there was a lot of strife, and there was a lot of what can only be described as mass slavery and genocide. So the question is, when we confront future technological developments, do we see those kinds of downsides happening with other types of technological breakthroughs? And can we avoid them with foresight, or are they inevitable? And in this particular situation, I think that I don't really see, I mean, there may be any number of dystopian consequences of their own character, but I don't see a lot of sort of low-level labor being exported out of the gravity well, because one of the the two primary expenses of life in space are getting out of the gravity well
and the atmosphere,
habitat, and life support. So if you're exporting a human out there as opposed to using an automated system powered by a neural net, they'd better have some skills. They better have something going on that's more than just being a warm body doing labor, or it's not going to be worth it.
I suppose you could farm people out, you can have multi-generations out there on Mars or something like that.
Well, yes, but then they're the descendants of the experts that you moved out there. So, I envisioned orbital space as sort of a portion of human society that had been very heavily filtered for expertise, high IQ, high agency. These are the people that had what it took to get out there in the first place. And so, you get a situation that looks a lot like these frontier cultures, like very, very early America, where, you would have to observe just from looking at their writings and their level of discourse that these were not a random sampling of the European populations that they came from.
I like that. I hope you're right.
Yeah, because I think that in order to make this palatable and possible, right? Because we live in a society at the end of the day where the will of people towards a certain path will influence how soon we get there. Right, so if you look at the government regulations, the government will regulate things into non-existence
Yes.
based on, I mean, primarily probably on the basis of closed door, back padding old boy networks. But sometimes the will of the people does influence it to the degree that regulations are passed, and so things can stop. And so if there's enough people that are afraid of the consequences of corporate expansion into space, you can imagine that the governments of the world would step in and prevent it from happening. And so from what you're saying, I think that it's really vital to be able to come up with a model for what it could look like that prevents us from repeating the mistakes of the past. Because it seems absurd to go out into space and to start this next chapter of exploration and opening the frontier and embodying this idea of humans as a multiplanetary species, but beginning that dream from such a catastrophic place.
Well, I think, first of all, that one of the major hazards of our future is government, and the because law is downstream from culture, and there's definitely a very real risk that law will be invoked to stop this kind of progress. And that comes from this attitude of, oh, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Well, that attitude in and of itself can be very dangerous because it's very easy to not make a mistake. All you have to do to not make a mistake is get yourself like a cup of tea and go in your room and sort of lock the door and be on the internet, watching reruns of I Love Lucy all day. In other words, it's very easy to not repeat the mistakes of the past by not doing anything. So there's a danger associated with repeating the mistakes of the past. And there's also a very real and I think underestimated danger of not repeating the successes of the past. Because if you look at the history of humanity, overwhelmingly the track record has been success. We went from being a plains ape, banging the rocks together, to now we are thinking about, should we put a city on the moon? That is a place of incredible privilege and incredible success. And it's very easy to take for granted all of the successes of the past and then take our society today and compare it to an ideal society that exists only in our heads and say, well, this is unbearable. As opposed to, this is better than every other thing we've had in the past. It's still not like where we would like to be.
I think about this a lot in terms of cultural identification with striving. There's a lot of talk of reparations for the ills of slavery and how to fix these past wrongs. And I think that there's also something to be said about, well, look, if America or any culture is to survive, there has to be a unified vision of what it means to embody that spirit. And it's hard to look at America like I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was 8. It is a place that I became a citizen probably only when I was like nearly 20. It's a place that I adopted, and that was a hard adoption because I think it was easy to look at the country from the standpoint of the ills. I grew up in California, super liberal, went to protests in Berkeley, had the whole arc of what the counterculture accurately points out as being the ills.
Exposed to a certain amount of communist propaganda.
I mean, I came from a communist country, so it was well balanced. We came from the Soviet Union, and so it was well balanced by the fact that my dad's listening to like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh on the way to school every morning.
Your family hates communism.
My family hates communism.
anyone who's
period.
lived through it hates
yes,
communism.
people who have been exposed to it tend to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I have a friend who's from China, and her mom's constantly like, "Communism is coming for America," and she's like, "Mom, don't worry."
Heavy headline.
Every headline. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a certain striving, this taking of an opportunity and making the best of it and figuring out how to work within the confines of the system that you are given in order to make something more of yourself than your parents were. Like, that's the story of America. And you can point to the fact that perhaps the robber barons definitely did more of that than anybody else. You can point to the fact that there are absolutely, there's the deep state, there's all of these forces, there's the corporate, like monarcho culture that's ruling things from behind the scenes. But still, it is a place where you can be from some lowest portion of society, the poorest of the poor, and raise yourself up to a different place. And that to me seems like what space travel and this motion forward into the universe represents. And so it gives us the opportunity to revisit this question of, well, what is it that binds us together as a species, as a people? And that seems to be exploration and creativity and the development of new tools and the finding of a place for ourselves in this inhospitable wasteland.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, humanity has always survived by growing. And both in the literal and in the metaphorical sense. We have this evolutionary strategy which is wrapped around having a very large brain and understanding our environment. And always, every time we have hit a resource barrier or a territory barrier, we have always innovated past it. That is our survival strategy as a species. And so my major concern when I think about culture comes from a very different perspective from some of the things that you're talking about. Not that you're necessarily wrong in every respect, but just that I have a different sort of priority list. And my priority list is that the innovation has to keep going, or in the long term, we run the very real risk of becoming extinct as a species.
There's a really interesting thing that I came across that's related to that, where some guy pulled a bunch of quotes from an anthropologist's visit to Tasmania. And there was an indigenous culture in Tasmania that had gotten separated from the mainland something like 20,000 years ago. And when they showed up to Tasmania, they had all of the same technological abilities as the indigenous tribes of mainland Australia. Then the sea level rose, they got stranded on Tasmania, they were a deeply isolated culture, and over the course of the next 20,000 years, before somebody found them again from the west in, I think, 1600s, they had lost all of their technological ability. They had somehow, in the absence of this competition of ideas and abilities, had somehow reverted to a more primitive technological society as opposed to one that kept innovating, which I just thought was a really wild example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I there's a term that engineers use a lot, and maybe other people use it as well. I don't know. We talk about the technology stack. And what that means to us is that is this stacking up in a particular field of these different platforms and innovations and devices that are all sort of interdependent on each other. And the layperson's thinking about technology and thinking about the use of technology seems to be, oh, well, we know these things, therefore we have this technology. It's sort of knowledge focused. And what's really going on is that you need this detailed understanding of how to implement the technology, and you need the tools to build the tools to build the tools. So one of the one of the things about technology is that it's an ongoing process that needs to be not only expanded but maintained. And the expansion process and the maintenance process have a lot of overlap. And you can experience technological decay if you don't constantly work within the technology and innovate in it. And this need becomes greater and greater as your need for as the technology you use becomes more sophisticated and the need for it becomes more integrated in our society. We experienced, for example, we had the Apollo program where we went to the moon.
I was just about to say that.
And we experienced a lot of technological decay when that impetus was abandoned. And I would argue that impetus, Freudian slip there. Impetus,
I mean, it kind of it's both apply. Both apply here.
There is something impotent about it.
Was abandoned in favor of a greater cultural focus on dividing up resources here on Earth. There's
either that or they just never went there in the first place.
There's always this fight between we should spend the majority of our effort focusing on how to divide up the resources versus we should spend our effort focusing on expanding the availability of resources.
I get the feeling that that the governments just nearly went broke doing it.
I think that's just a feeling, because if you look at the overall percentage that NASA's budget represented of the federal budget versus the percentage of the federal budget that is represented by entitlements, those are two very different numbers.
What do you mean by entitlements?
Things that the entitlements is a word meaning things that the government pays out.
Oh, you mean like
welfare, social security, this kind of thing. Yeah, that actually represents a majority of the federal budget.
Even during the Apollo missions, I feel like the social network, the social safety net wasn't as well developed.
Less so during the Apollo missions, but I think that if people were to get an itemized tax bill, they would really be very, very surprised at the relative sizes of some of these items.
Yeah, I guess they spent like a 2024 equivalent of $280 billion getting to the moon. From best I can find, I'm trying to figure out what $280 billion buys you today.
Yeah, and that's over the course of, I don't know how long the Mercury, Apollo, and Gemini programs ran for, but I would.
But for example, there's
off the top of my head, it would be over a decade.
Mm.
Yeah, it took a long time, and
Yeah.
today we spend 2024 Department of Defense had a $2.08 trillion distribution amongst its 6 subcomponents. So
yeah.
Yeah,
and I think
not that much money.
One of the things we can look at also is that it was made massively more expensive because it was a government project. I mean, if we look at NASA's annual budget today, it's about $27 billion, which doesn't represent a huge chunk of the federal budget. But if we look at for example, the total program cost of Starship, SpaceX's heavy lift orbital launch program, the total cost of that was not quite $3 billion.
Wow.
So it is basically private industry is outdoing all of these government programs. And you can sort of try to scrutinize the figures and say, well, how much of this is building on what the government program already did? And that's really, really, really hard to say. Nobody gets to know what would have happened. But I think if we look at the numbers today, we can very clearly see that the way forward does not consist of expanding the federal budget into this, that, or the other, but simply sort of allowing private industry to develop these technologies in a way that is self-financing. Because SpaceX really has to be understood as a trucking company. They're a trucking company.
Sure.
Their whole way of doing things is we're going to load your stuff on our semi rig, and we're going to drive it from New York to Los Angeles, and you're going to pay us. Except in this case, it's Texas and high orbit.
They also design trucks too, right?
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, Musk is talking about building a colony on Mars as well.
Mhm.
So it's like
Yeah.
it's a vertically integrated
Yeah.
system that he's developing that isn't just the truck. So it's almost like the trucking company provides the basis for then expanding into the next phase of development.
Building the truck stops.
Yeah. All of the
Exactly.
things that can be done out in orbital space that can't be done very easily on Earth at all. And the challenges there are going to be getting out there, and that's what SpaceX is tackling now. But there's going to be another set of technological challenges, which is living out there.
Mm.
And those are all surmountable. And I talk about some of the ways those can be surmounted a little later on in the book. I don't want to spoil too much, but there are the various realities of life in a habitat or spacecraft in the vacuum of space. And that is another set of technical challenges. But as Elon Musk once pointed out, the future is just something that happens to you at 1 second per second. The future in the science fiction sense is something that you have to make happen. Somebody has to go out and do the engineering. And to that I would add, you have to go out and do the engineering while it seems unfeasible. Because if it seemed feasible, somebody would already have done it. You have to be audacious.
Hey folks, quick interruption. I really need your help. This program is entirely supported by patrons. That means we don't have any ads on this. We don't have to put any sponsors on this. We don't have to sell you anything. You just make it happen by going over to patreon.com and supporting our project. Hope to see you there.
I always think about this in terms of evolutionary futures, because I think you're totally right. You live in a world and you see some destination that you want to move towards, and rarely is it one person who does that. It's a collective of people who are interested in working on the same project, because Elon Musk, without a company of engineers that shares his vision, is just a guy who's talking about building rockets.
Yeah,
like he needs.
That word vision is so important. You need that vision to unite people.
And charisma and technical know-how, because he could just be like a crazy dude who has bad ideas, right? Like schizophrenics are visionaries.
Yeah.
And so there's a blend of being able to capture the zeitgeist, being able to have a vision that can recruit people behind it, and then also making sure that people have faith that you are somebody who can actually deliver on that, as opposed to just being some schlub.
Yeah, and I speak of vision not just in terms of somebody having vision or somebody having a vision, but the idea of a vision as an entity in itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because it has to expand beyond one person. Ultimately, if it's just Elon Musk, and if it's just people who admire him personally and who work at his companies, that's not enough. It has to be a shared idea of a goal that is conceivable, achievable, and worthwhile on the part of everybody whose cooperation is required. So it's like, okay, great, you built this one company, SpaceX, and you've got people who believe in you and are backing you, but you need other companies participating in that space. You need entire generations of young people growing up and choosing to go to engineering school instead of studying sociology or something because this vision excites them. And that's what we had with the science fiction of the 50s and 60s. And it's what we don't have with the science fiction of today. So that's what I wanted to do is inspire people to think about growth and achievement again.
And so you mentioned the Apollo program and the dissolution of that ambition being related to this desire to make, what was it, to provide for people on Earth at the exclusion of everything else. So you think it started then?
I think that was part of it. I think that in part the Apollo program itself was being participated in for idealistic reasons, but it was being funded partially by politicians for cynical reasons. Hey, look, Soviets, we have these missiles. Because an ICBM and an orbital launch rocket are very much kind of the same technology. So in a certain sense, there was an overlap between the space race and the arms race. But I think that as the Apollo program wound down, there was a certain lack of public excitement about this vision of we're going to the stars. And there was a wide focus, maybe on the part of the baby boomers, on, gosh, we don't like the way our parents handled things on Earth. We want to sort of socially reconstruct society. And that's the vision that we are excited about. And so it's not so much about a conscious, let's stop doing space. It's more about a generation that is excited about things other than space.
Well, it was also like the Vietnam War was going on around the time that the Apollo program was shut down. And so I think that there's these moments where things get really bad on Earth. And I think that it's easy in that moment to be like, what are we doing? Like, we're sending 18-year-olds to go die in the jungles addicted to heroin in a war that has no real justification for our involvement. We're spending this money on space travel. There's huge public movements of the civil rights era. I think that people are starting to get worried about overpopulation, like the Club of Rome is publishing, Limits to Growth is on deck. Like, all of these things, people are worried about famine in India. There's all of these things that are coalescing where they're like, what are we doing? And so I think that a program like the Apollo program can only come out of a time of prosperity if it's funded by the government.
Well, out of a time not only of prosperity, but of perceived prosperity and hope.
Optimism.
One of the lessons that we are learning in the 21st century is that a lot of the things you just talked about were mistakes. Worrying about overpopulation was a huge mistake because overpopulation was not a threat.
Well,
and it very much turned out that now the threat is underpopulation. Now we're experiencing
there's a very vocal minority that doesn't believe that to be the case.
Yeah, like this is...
And they're wrong.
Well, that's why it's interesting talking to you, actually, because most of the academics that we've talked to about the future of material resource exchange on the planet and so forth do seem to, if not explicitly, they do seem to harbor some suspicion and fear of overpopulation.
Yeah,
they've learned not to say it out loud.
They're wrong.
So it's this subtext. And I mean, there's like collapsing populations in all urban centers. And so all of these really advanced countries that have high GDP, Their populations are
The
cratering.
highest IQ, highest agency populations are collapsing, and that is one of the biggest threats to the future of the human race because we survive by innovating. No, academia has developed some very, very sick, toxic cultural beliefs, and it has become so insular that those beliefs have become self-reinforcing.
But so the reason that I don't disagree with you about the
Mhm.
fact that overpopulation did not end up being the crisis that we thought it was going to be. But I almost feel like the reason for that is that modernity has poisoned us into not reproducing. Like there's the calculus where, okay, so 100 years ago, you live on a farm, your kids immediately are useful to you. They help you bring in the harvest, they work in the fields, and so the calculus of having a child ends up being that the child is going to, within a few years, start to pay dividends for your investment.
They're also probably going to die, so
Yeah, exactly. Like mortality is high. And so as we become more urban, we become densely packed into these cities. And so having a child becomes gradually more and more of a liability on a social scale, first of all. And then second of all, we're exposed to insane amounts of chemicals that are endocrine disrupting. They're teratogens. They're like doing crazy things to our hormonal systems and literally just like screen technology.
Yeah, well, if we want to go into if we wanted to go into the factors behind the fertility crisis, that would be a 3-hour conversation right there, and we would barely scratch the surface. But I think that one of the things that sort of is important is sort of recognition that there is a fertility crisis and recognition that the human reproductive cycle is extremely fragile. And in a sense, the one thing that I would point to is that reproductive fragility is the price we pay for our cognitive ability,
Hmm.
because we literally have to deliver physically these infants with huge heads. And so this makes childbirth very difficult, but it also
it takes them
means
another 20 years to get their head
yeah,
working.
yeah, it also means that these human beings have to be delivered prematurely. You know, from a standpoint of sort of ideal development, the human gestation period is way too short. Yeah, and you can see this when you look at the infants of other species. Horses can run a few hours after being born. Human infants can't lift their own heads with their necks. So it's like we have to get these giant skulls out in a condition that from the perspective of every other species would be a premature birth. And so now we have these infants that are fragile and helpless and utterly needy for many, many years. And so then childcare becomes a very difficult process. And downstream of that, we look at it and say, oh, it's so expensive to have kids. Well, yeah, throughout most of history, the labor of half of the species was not totally devoted to child rearing, but a majority of their efforts were devoted to child rearing. And, now that we've integrated that half of the species into the workforce, we maybe need to do some head scratching about how do we decrease the friction for the reproductive cycle, especially the friction for the reproductive cycle of the high IQ, high agency, high sophistication populations that really drive human technological expansion. And that's what I'm really worried about. I'm worried about Idiocracy, the film.
I think many of us are.
Well, I think a lot of the development of human beings is predicated upon exposure to environments that are commensurate with them growing into something that they could be ideally.
Mhm.
Like a horse comes out, it can run, right? But a human comes out and you have to teach it how to run because there's so much background mimetic heredity going on.
Yeah.
It's so integral to the human experience that you learn about the world that you're in, and that makes us so adaptive. And so
Yeah.
so the environment itself, the intellectual environment of that child seems to play more heavily into it than almost anything.
Yeah.
So before we get too far down this path, I want to close the loop on what you were saying earlier about optimism and the way that the Apollo space program came out of a time of optimism, was shut down in a time of pessimism, and you were saying that a lot of the things that we were pessimistic about didn't come to pass. And it
Yes.
seemed like you were going to make a point about the resurgence of optimism and the need for optimism now, even though things seem dire, but you didn't
Yeah.
finish it.
Yeah, I think we're starting to realize that a lot of these fears were mistaken, and that a lot of the what were perceived as corrective measures actually created worse problems than the fears themselves. For example, it's very tempting, I think, especially among the academic community, to look at things like, say, Vietnam as a huge disaster. Oh, it was this unjustified war that caused this terrible suffering. Well, looking back in hindsight, the problem was that it was gone about the wrong way because, now we really understand that communism needed to be stopped urgently. And, the problem was, of course, that you went about it in this way that made people perceive you as a foreign invader, and fighting back as resistance to a foreign invader rather than fighting for communism. And so you get this sort of unilateral perception that this was a huge mistake in its goals, not in its methods. And certainly it was perceived as a sort of a disastrous wrongdoing by the boomer generation, mostly because they didn't want to go and fight and their opinion was not being asked, which was another huge mistake. It's very destructive on a societal level to take these kinds of actions without first getting buy-in. And but if we want to allow sort of that, because what happened in their interpretation of that was that the the opposition to the Vietnam War on the part of the boomer generation became a sympathetic view towards socialism. And having a sympathetic view towards socialism and communism had far more disastrous consequences for our entire civilization than just going and fighting the Vietnam War.
I would agree with communism being a universal disaster, but I mean, there's lots of democratic socialist countries that seem to be doing really well, like
Yeah,
Norway, Finland, Sweden, like the Nordics, a lot of Europe.
You can afford a certain amount of socialist policy if you find a sort of a huge offshore oil reserve that you can use to fund
Yeah,
all
it's true.
these programs
If you have
that you
good
want to
resources.
fund.
Yeah.
But when
And I
we
think that
talk
there's
about,
something
if
in
if
there.
I may,
Yeah, go ahead.
when we talk about socialism, in terms of certain kinds of public spending that we want to call morally imperative, I would say that I personally disagree, but that's a matter of opinion. But what we have observed, which is a matter of fact, is that socialism doesn't self-fund. It needs to get its money from somewhere. So a lot of what these societies that call themselves democratic socialist are in fact capitalist economies which choose to spend some of that wealth in a sort of a wealth redistributory manner. And that's far different than the beliefs of the Bolsheviks who thought that a centrally planned economy could fund itself and actually run. And for the past few, maybe 5 or 6 decades, we in the West have been experimenting with taking more and more central control of the economy. And I would ask you, maybe if you came to the United States more recently, it's a hard question to answer. But I would ask people in general, do you really think that we're relatively wealthier today than we were in the 80s? Goodness.
Gas costs more, that's for sure.
Yeah. Everything costs more.
And that opens a deep tangent into, wealth and prosperity. I would say that people probably have more gadgets than they did in the 80s. You have more stuff available to you. People take more flights. They go on more vacations. They have more toys.
Certainly,
it's
technology
TV is cheaper.
has
Yeah,
made
that's true.
things
Like
made
Netflix
things
in the
more available.
80s. Can you imagine the
Yeah.
relative wealth of having Amazon Studios, Netflix Studios, every single piece of content ever made for your consumption?
Spotify.
Yeah.
Like, I remember there's some insane statistic which is like 10,000 books a day get self-published on Amazon.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just like the wealth of entertainment. If you're looking at just toys, I would say that we have way more
if you
toys
look
than we
at the
did in the 80s.
numbers, if you look at this kind of count the number of books available, it paints one picture. But if you compare the experience on the ground of someone living in the 80s versus the experience on the ground of someone living in 2020, and I'm in an ideal position to do this because I'm 50 years old. So I grew up in the 80s, and one of the things we experienced was that there was much more of a sense of financial security then. There was much more of a sense of the availability of resources to afford the things that were there to be afforded. And since then, we've had massive, massive, massive inflation of the currency. And I think there's a general sense that people are really starting to feel the pinch. And I would put that down to a lot of sort of centralized tampering with the American economy, not just in terms of centralized planning being inefficient, but also in the sense that pooling resources in one place creates vastly expanded opportunities for corruption and looting. And I think we're seeing a lot of that nowadays.
That's hard to argue with.
Yeah.
Shiloh, do you want to go back in the direction of this?
Well, yeah, gosh. So we were talking about this extended childhood and playing with the idea of why people aren't choosing to have children in these certain populations that you're concerned about.
Yeah.
And we didn't really play with a solution set for that. You said you were worried about it, and I suggested that perhaps retooling the environment so that it's more conducive towards those children being able to have that extra, what would you call it, postpartum gestation, the 20 odd years that it takes to get somebody, to get their software updated so they can be a fully functioning human being. Is there a way to lubricate that process in the ideal future for you?
I think that one of the things that, and this is one of the places where I disagree very deeply with what the United States would call the right wing. I think there's a perception on the part of a lot of conservatives that you can just return to the way that you did things 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, and that will work out just fine because it worked out just fine then. And what I think is that technology often obsoletes certain parts of our way of life, and we have to change the culture to adapt. And I would say that the fertility crisis represents an area where we simply have not done that. Because you talked a little bit about having children in an agrarian environment. And what I would say is to play off that, to build off that, I would say that if you live in an agrarian society and a young man can support himself and a family by doing farm labor at the age of 16, or by farming his own readily available land as you're expanding out west, then it becomes very feasible to tell young people, don't have sex until you get married, because you can afford to get married at 16. You know, teenagers, you can nag teenagers into keeping it in their pants for 2 or 3 years after puberty. It works. It's okay. But then when you have this industrialized and technological society where first you have to get a high school education, and then you have to get a college education, and then you have to spend a couple of years sort of applying for jobs and scrambling to try to build a career. All of a sudden, it's like now you can finally afford a home and maybe to support a family, and you're 30 years old, and you're starting to reach not the twilight of your life, obviously, but you're starting to get into those years where you're less fertile. And the more of a societal elite you represent, the more, the more time and effort you're putting into this kind of career building and ascending to the pinnacle of society. And the biological requirements of that fertility have kind of fallen by the wayside. And we have failed as a culture to not only to adapt to this, but even really to acknowledge it. And I think that one of the reasons that we failed to do so is that it presents some choices that feel very unfair to women. Like, oh, you don't get to build a career because you have to have kids first. And women want to say, well, no, I want to be able to do what the men are able to do, and, go out and adventure in the world and build a career and have nice things. And then I want to have kids. And unfortunately, sort of the biological realities don't line up with that. And we haven't found a good solution for this yet. So maybe the solution is a social restructuring where we find some way for women to have the opportunity to have children first and then have a career. Or maybe the solution is technological, where we start to move away from the bottlenecks on the human reproductive cycle. It's like, okay, we're going to combine these gametes and then we're going to put them in
That's
an
already happening,
artificial
right?
machine. Yeah.
To some
And
extent, right?
we don't know what the ramifications of that will be, but if we want our most intelligent and effective and useful humans to keep reproducing and having kids, we need to make it easier on them. We can't just stand there and lecture them about the 1950s. We need to reduce the friction.
In a world where people, like in the United States, where you can start off poor and become something else, that's at least the ideal, right? It does happen. I don't know how often, but it definitely happens. In that world, is it necessary for the biological parents to be the same ones as the children making parents? Is it necessary is it
People wanna
necessary
raise
to
their
have?
own kids?
Well, not. I don't think that Shiloh is saying like the
I said that really
shift
poorly.
of children from one reproductive couple to another.
Yeah.
But if you look at fertility rates, the lowest income deciles have the highest fertility rate.
That's right.
Yes.
And so if you have a lateral, or if you have the ability for the children born to the lowest income,
To replace
Groups.
the fading population from the upper IQ groups and so forth. Does it really matter that the upper IQ groups aren't actually having children?
It does. And this gets into one of these uncomfortable conversations that nobody wants to have.
Let's do it.
But I am a disagreeable curmudgeon, so I will.
sure.
Yeah, let's go.
And I would say that, you know, people are equal before the law. They are not equal. You know, not every human being is equally useful. You cannot simply replace an IQ is very heritable. An agency is even more heritable. And you cannot...
Including like in twin studies also, or just, how do you separate out the nurturing side of that, I suppose, would be my question.
Well, you don't. You don't have to. You don't have to.
That's exactly
Because
my point, yeah.
It doesn't matter from this perspective. You can't simply take an underclass and replace all your scientists and engineers with them and expect that to come out well. We've had a huge experiment in academia. A lot of it has gone on in academia with saying, let's take the underclass and let's bring them into these top producing institutions. I believe it's called diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's been a disaster.
Yeah,
but
but
I think it's been a disaster.
There is no
I-
Harvard anymore. There is only Zool.
I think.
yeah, but bringing in underperforming people is different than giving people the opportunities to try out for the team or something like that, right? Like if
and
there's
to
a lot
prepare
of
them for
yes,
trying
but
out
that's
for the
not
team.
what
Yeah.
happened. It's
that's not what's
bringing in
happened.
underperforming
Of course,
people.
of course.
You know,
Yeah,
let's
that's
stop
a
lying
disaster.
to ourselves.
But a lot of like my favorite scientists came from nowhere. Like Faraday, Tesla, like these people just kind of come from nowhere, and they're self-educated. Da Vinci was like this too. They'd really just take it upon themselves.
Yeah, but we're not admitting Da Vinci's. We're not admitting Faraday.
But we should be. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Is that the reason that DEI has failed is not because there's something about people from lower income groups that immediately says that they don't have these capabilities.
Right, like on a genetic level or something.
It's the fact that what they've done is instead of nurturing the intellectual development of these poorest populations and then allowing the smartest, brightest, most driven people in those groups to then rise to positions of prominence, the attempt to equalize has been deeply misguided and fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, it's like ignoring that
It's been run
postpartum
by
period.
midwits. It's been run by midwits for midwits. And you know, it's been a disaster on every level, because the thing is that if someone is talented, you know, you don't need to do a whole lot. You just need to get out of their way.
They need a little bit of guidance though, right? Because like someone who's super brilliant and talented can end up like Rick Ross selling cocaine for millions of dollars a day, or they could be shifted into tech development.
That's what you incentivized.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's that postpartum development.
Effective incentives. You know, all you really need to do if you want to see more scientists come from the underclass is start rewarding scientists and, you know, stop paying millions and millions of dollars to basketball players. You know, they all want to be basketball players and rap stars. Why? Because they make more, because that's who our society rewards.
That's who their culture exposes them to, which is what's really interesting. I mean, you can get really deep in the weeds about why their culture exposes them to that. But
yeah, sure.
That's why I keep cycling around this idea of paying more attention to that postpartum development. We need to really, really not lose sight of the fact that humans take 20 plus years to develop.
Yeah, but when we do that, we need to come from first confronting certain uncomfortable truths, because the reason we had DEI, the reason it was such a disaster, is we didn't confront those uncomfortable truths first. And the uncomfortable truth that, is gonna chill the air in the room several degrees when I say it, is that certain of the prejudices of traditional culture were a load-bearing structure.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, like what?
I mean, they were a load-bearing structure in civilization, and we removed them.
No, which load-bearing, which beliefs?
Well, that's the sticky part. But the first thing I'm trying to articulate is the idea that some of these beliefs were load-bearing. Just that there exist load-bearing beliefs that we have removed. So, and what we see in the results of diversity, equity, and inclusion is that certain people were ushered into academia who were not capable of benefiting from it, and who were not capable of being productive there. And we ushered those people in, rolled out the red carpet for them, in favor of passing over some people who could benefit from it and who could benefit us from it. And we did this on the basis of race.
Which I think is a stupid way of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, if you took like a random sampling of white people and threw them into the same positions, it'd also be a freaking disaster, right? They're selective meritocratic institutions for a reason, right?
Yeah, we discarded meritocracy.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that meritocracy was a load-bearing structure.
For sure.
And the belief that some people are smarter and better than others is a load-bearing belief.
I mean, that's hard to argue. I think that the way that
it's hard to argue, but we don't talk about it because it makes everybody uncomfortable.
No, I think we do talk about it. Like, I mean, if you spend any amount of time on Twitter, there's this guy tracing wood grains. I don't know if you follow him at all. He's been doing a lot of research for. He was working on Katie Herzog and Jesse.
But try imagining having that conversation 5 years ago.
I mean, I think people still were. It just they were vilified
off the platform.
That's entirely possible. Yeah. I mean, he had receipts, though. He had receipts.
You are seeing this conversation now is because Elon Musk bought Twitter.
He also had receipts. Like, he had so, like, what the thing that I'm thinking of specifically is that there was a test for air traffic controllers where there was clear evidence that the minority applicants were being told what answers they were supposed to give on the test in order to perform better so that they would pass along into these positions.
Well, yes, but that's what DEI is. That's what it has been from the beginning. There was no leveling of the playing field. There was only Zool.
I think that the mistake here would be to say that there's something inherent about the minority group that makes them less worthy or less capable. Because what Shiloh's saying is, he's like, look, if you take a bunch of people from like an Appalachian holler,
or just from my hometown, honestly, just a random smattering.
California?
He's from Ohio.
Okay, where do you live now?
We live in rural Oregon.
Okay, have you ever lived in Appalachia? In the South?
I mean, my dad's family's all from down there on the Ohio River and stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, I spent a lot of time there as a kid. I mean, my grandma was like hunting in the mountains and shotgun grandma and huge, grew her own food and trapping and all that stuff. So, but my point is, if you just take a random smattering of white people from Ohio, and throw them into Harvard too, it's going to be the same crap outcome. I just don't think it has anything to do with race at the end of the day.
It's going to be a crap outcome. But what I want to point out is that when I have this conversation, when I say these things, one of the things that makes you uncomfortable and that you primarily focus on is this idea that we need to make sure that we're not having this conversation about race.
Oh, no, we can do that.
This is not a conversation about race, but it's this the focus in these kind of programs has been in trying to force outcomes to be race neutral or to favor certain races rather than to look at the merits of the individual. There has been no looking at the merits of the individual.
Sure. And so the point is not that attempting to right past wrongs that have been effected along racial lines is a hopeless and worthless project that we should abandon. It's that the structure of DEI was hopeless and it could never have worked.
It is a hopeless and worthless project that we should abandon. This is me saying it.
So, like, why somebody who's born in the projects should be abandoned by society? Like, why?
I don't know what you mean by abandoned by society.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that there's some fraction of the population that's born under terribly disadvantaged circumstances. And in order to create a society that actually values meritocracy and values performance, you would find ways to develop the minds of the people from all classes, cultures, and backgrounds in order to have a group that sits at the top that is the most capable.
There has always been a fraction of society that is born into terribly disadvantaged circumstances.
Sure.
This only started making people uncomfortable when somebody made the conversation about race. Yeah,
I don't know about that. I mean, like
the poor have always been with us.
And it's always been
people
horrible.
In disadvantaged circumstances have always been. Yes. Well, it's also horrible that people die of old age.
And we're working on that.
And yeah.
So it's like, why not work on all of it? Like, you look at Brian Johnson.
I think, like, to simplify it, there's a bigger project, which is how can we make more functional people as a whole? How can we do that? How can we increase this population of high IQ, high agency people? And then there's a separate project of the implementation of it, right? The implementation of it is this DEI nonsense, which isn't working, right? And so there's a question of implementation versus the whole project, whether the project should be abandoned. I think that's what Anastasia's trying to get at.
Well, when you say we, what that implies is that the basic assumption here is that we are all going to take collective action, that everybody is going to agree on a policy, and we are all going to proceed on this program in lockstep, and that is how we are going to solve our problems. The fact is that a genius, wherever that genius comes from, is an extremely valuable thing. And so that kind of person is a very worthwhile investment. And there are huge dividends to people who locate undiscovered talent, in the same way that there are huge dividends to buying a penny stock that proves to be, extremely valuable. So when you're looking at a population that is disadvantaged by financial circumstances or by cultural circumstances or whatever, and you don't see a lot of gifted and successful individuals coming from there, what that actually means is that no one has figured out how to mine that population for talent yet. And whether it's because the talent doesn't exist, or whether it's because we don't know how to locate it.
I think it definitely can be shown to exist. Just if you look at art, and you look at
let me come to my point here. The fact that we don't know how to find that talent is real, and having a widespread social program where the government will punish you for not solving this problem does not magically make you able to solve the problem.
Sure.
It just makes you sort of run around trying to game the system so that you don't get punished. For example, if I start a business, I can get sued once the business reaches a certain size for not having a certain number of employees of X racial group. I can get sued, and I must prove that I am not discriminating. But the fact that I don't have a number of employees of X race is taken as ipso facto evidence that I must be discriminating because the prior assumption is that they exist
Mm-hmm.
and that I know how to find them. Well, I don't know how to find them. Which makes these companies desperate to find employees of a certain racial demographic, and they will hire them even when they are not qualified because they are trying to avoid being punished by the government.
Which is
And-
like a clear and classic case of improperly structured incentives. Right? Like that's obviously like on the face of it, that's
The
obviously an
incentive
absurd
to
term.
find talented individuals already exists. It's when we tamper with the incentives that we produce these bizarrely distorted results.
Well, the incentive here is not purely the key incentive here is not just to find talented individuals. The incentive is to
Not get
write
sued.
when
not get
that's the
sued,
superficial and that's what ends up with the regulation. But at the core of it, the kernel of it is to say that hey, there are a series of social and cultural structures that have created an inequality of opportunity, and we need to do something about that in order to be able to find and mine the people that are of those groups that can be raised out of the miserable conditions in which they were born. Like
I disagree that that's the incentive.
but
I
at the
think
heart,
that's
at the heart of it.
I think that that's the excuse. I think that what's behind this program is that this program or this societal initiative is that it's being run as a massive grift.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing.
Someone figured out a way to hack human civilization.
Well, so is COVID.
Someone figured out a way to hack Western civilization, and they said, look, these guys have all these classical liberal ideas, and it's produced a massive amount of wealth, and we can get at some of this wealth if we call them mean and accuse them of being racists. That's all it is. It's a cash grab.
So is COVID, right? Like we've seen this play out multiple times over the course of the last few years, where it's people have become increasingly capable of hacking Western civilization, as you put it, in order to get people to do stuff that benefits some group of people, whether that's the people who run the DEI initiatives or the people who run the COVID initiatives, whatever. Like somebody's getting rich off of this.
So what's urgent, what's far more urgent than finding every talented individual in disadvantaged circumstances is to stop the hacking of Western civilization.
And so to bring this back to where we started, how do you do that as you move into space and you start to develop this interplanetary society, which ultimately will be run by large corporations under these same corrupt incentives? I mean, if the past century is any proof of this, you have small corporations that gradually get agglomerated into larger and larger and larger ones. Like, I don't know if you guys do you have like
the government
Kroger?
favors that. The government favors that.
It's also economies of scale.
The more regulation you have, regulations are more burdensome on small organizations than on large ones. So if you kill off all the small egg-eating mammals, you get more dinosaurs.
Yeah, counting your receipts at tax season will teach any small business owner that private hell that really exists for you.
It's very easy to continue to exist as a large business. You know, the state will help you with that. and it's very hard to break into becoming a small business. The state will not help you with that. So I'd like to get back to the main thrust of your question. Sorry if I was quibbling
I was
there.
actually starting to think about this dinosaur breeding program that you
Yeah.
put on the table.
So yeah, you're saying how do we in essence what you're asking is how do we balance the need for progress with the desire for fairness?
Yeah.
I think in abstract, that's what the question is. I think the first thing that we have to realize in and the answer is that we have to just look at a lot of these little questions and solve them by thinking very hard and working very hard. But I think that sort of in the large scale, there's this where teenage rebelliousness comes from, and what led to the boomers becoming a political movement is there's a gap. There's a gap between the age at which teenagers realize that the world is not as fair and as well run and as sorted out as the adults told you when you were a child. It's full of unpleasant things happening to people. So there's a certain age where you realize that, and then you get mad. You get mad at your parents because they didn't fix these problems. And then there's another age where you sort of grow up all the way and you realize that these problems don't exist because of the lack of the political will to solve them. They exist because these problems are hard and nobody has figured out how to solve them. So I think initiatives like DEI exist, these conscious sort of government programs that are sold as we're going to make the world fair. They exist in that space where it's like we realize the world has problems, but we think those problems exist because nobody gives a shit, as opposed to those problems exist because nobody's figured out how to do it. And I think the best way that you can make life better for the people who are worst off is to build better technology and make life better for everybody. Because we can talk about grinding poverty and misery compared to our own lives. But if we compare that grinding poverty and misery to the grinding poverty and misery of the past, when the technology state was less advanced, we see that it's less horrible and there's less of it.
Yeah.
So the best thing we can do is make all of civilization more technologically sophisticated and richer. And then, maybe some people who wouldn't have been able to thrive before now will thrive. I mean, my parents on both sides came from farm families in rural North Dakota. And they were able to go to college and get professional jobs. And because they went to college and got professional jobs, now I'm able to exist in that space throughout my career and now become an entrepreneur as I retire. Building wealth is often a multi-generational process. And most of the people who are unable to participate in that in a capitalist society, it's usually that there's something that's getting in the way of that. That can be addiction, that can be mental health issues, that can be a life skills deficit. But taking someone from this background and shoehorning them into Harvard, I could tell you right away that it wasn't going to work. But now we have concrete evidence that it's not going to work.
Yeah.
You know,
And
we
I mean,
can't treat Harvard as if it were magic dirt that's going to uplift everyone who steps on it.
I mean, the full foot on or whatever, like full throttle ahead with technology isn't without its cautions as well, though, right? I mean, if you think about the technological, I think in the long run, you're right. We've lifted a lot of people out of poverty. There's absolutely no question about that. And so you have to be really, really, really careful when you kick the machine. But what about social media? What about porn addictions? What about social isolation? You know, the technological boom of the last 20 years has been arguably really bad for a lot of people.
And as I said, you in technological advancement, you often get these periods where something is going to make things better in the long run, but in the short run, it makes it worse. And that's because our environment consists largely of things that we have built ourselves. I mean, if you look around the room that you are in now, it's going to take you a few minutes to spot something that wasn't built by a human.
we've very intentionally.
You have a plant.
We have many plants.
You have plants.
We got our cat sitting over here on the couch too.
Yeah, you put them there for a reason, but you get my point.
Yeah, absolutely.
You get my point. We make our own environments. So when we have the capacity to create a new environment, a new environmental aspect like social media, which allows us to have this conversation right now, then sometimes it can be maladapted to us, or we can be maladapted to it because we don't understand our needs and we don't understand what it's going to do. And
it's
then
even worse than that.
Gain that understanding and adapt.
Well, I think that's what's creepy about it is I think it's born on the back of really understanding human needs and exploiting them, right? Like psychology, the number one job for psychologists is going to work for one of these marketing firms over at Facebook or something like that, right? Yeah. I mean, hacking the brain is really what this hasn't been an innocent accident. This has all been designed in the interests of capturing audiences and making money for shareholders.
Yeah. And it seems like helping people survive in space is going to put this into overdrive as well, because I can't think of a more isolating and man-made environment than a spaceship.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And theft of fire goes into that because you get what is the psychological effect of this person who's because he's in these poor circumstances and he's doing all this stuff to try to save his business. He's been placed in a very isolating environment, being out alone in space for months at a time. And then this other individual who is very different from him comes along and invades that space. And now they're stuck in this little hull together and they have to either destroy each other or find some way to prosper together. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for the human species as a whole. We're stuck with each other and we have to either destroy each other or find ways to prosper together. And if we're going to do the latter, it has to be started on finding out what human nature is like and what our real needs are and how we can use technology to fulfill that. But, you know, we only have two options. We have the accelerator or the brake. And if we hit the brakes, we die.
Can the accelerator solve the crisis in the Middle East?
It's hard to say, but I think that in the long run, technology solves every problem, creates new problems for us as fast as it solves them, and the problems that it creates for us are slightly less bad than the problems it solves.
Interesting.
Yes, I just wonder if there isn't something about human nature that really has a way of aligning itself against something, another people. Like there's that tribal element.
Sure.
I wonder
we're programmed to separate into tribes and throw rocks at each other. And eventually, I think that when things are going to become really interesting is when we start to have the capability to really tinker with our own programming on a genetic level. When technology is not just the decision of how we want to live, but who we want to be.
And that might be a good place to put a pin in it, because that's another 3 hours easily.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this has been a really fun conversation. We spend a lot of time talking about these things. I think that we kind of come at it from probably different starting points, but I really value your insights into human nature and the way that all of these structures work. We didn't really dive into I know that you're pretty libertarian, is that fair to
Yes.
say?
Yes.
And so we
yes.
didn't really touch on the politics of that at all. We haven't touched upon, the future of genetic engineering. And so I hope that we have the chance to sit down
Yeah.
again.
I think we did maybe touch on the politics a little bit,
Just a
where
tiny
we were sort of talking about the merits of centralized solutions versus libertarianism kind of endorses this swarm intelligence approach to advancing civilization by sort of getting out of the way where everybody tries their own thing and we imitate the ones that are successful. But no, we didn't go too deep into the politics. So there's.
But I really think that progress is one of my, if I was to describe myself as having central values, I think that progress is definitely one of them. Because I talk to conservatives and I understand their worries and their fears about the direction that the world is going in. But I always walk away from these conversations with this feeling that there's no way to go back. There's no way to bottle like agrarian 1850s existence and then have it be technologically advanced in some way where it's, robotic tractors or something
Oh
and
yeah,
still
yeah,
families with like 15
yeah,
children. Like
yeah.
that's not
Well,
possible.
I'm definitely more politically aligned with the right. So a lot of my following is rather right wing. And I often find myself in this conversation with them where I'm saying, okay, technology changes the terrain permanently. So I understand very, very deeply what conservatives actually want to conserve. And those things are tremendously important. But there's a sort of a persuasion task where I have to say, okay, you have to find new ways to conserve them. You can't conserve them in the old ways that they were conserved because the the very fact that we're here right now means that those old ways stopped working. We have to find new ways to preserve what we think is valuable and important about the human experience.
Yeah, like there's this idea where, before you start saying that we should go back to something, you should really understand why it is that people left that way of doing things behind.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't happen
Yeah.
accidentally. If everybody
Yeah.
universally hated mechanization and urbanization, we wouldn't be in the position where we are right now. Like, obviously,
Yeah.
it offered something much preferable to the situation that people were
Yeah,
living in.
there's the phenomenon of Chesterton's fence, where you don't necessarily want to knock a fence down until you understand what it does. But there's also a reverse sort of Chesterton's fence effect, where if you want to build the fence back up, you have to understand why people knocked it down in the first place. And maybe the fence needs to be redesigned or to be moved into a different place. So if I had a political philosophy, it would be that we need to we need to adapt our needs as humans. It is that we need to reconcile our needs as humans with the circumstances created by technological progress and find a way to acknowledge both and to reconcile them.
We can call that Erikson's fence.
Yeah, maybe so.
I like that. All right. I think that we should let's put a pin in it for now. We'd love to have you back. At least I would. I think Shiloh
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Yeah, this has been fun.
Ditto.
It has actually been very fun to speak to someone who comes from sort of academia a little bit. Am I reading that right?
I mean, I would.
Yeah, I didn't even get into that, but a lot of these things are very personal for me, right? Because I am sort of suffering under a lot of these bureaucratic bloats, and I only teach one course a term, so it's not that big of a piece of my life, but it's something I have direct contact with, right?
You come from that social culture, and that's made this a very interesting conversation, because a lot of the conversations I have are with people who are very enthusiastic about my libertarian political views. So they're much more libertarian, some of them are more right wing, and it's very interesting to get that different perspective.
I think it's a funny representation of our audience that we've had multiple people. We have patrons, and at least a couple of people have left the Patreon because they're like, I don't really like how right wing you guys are. And I'm like, I don't.
Yeah, that's interesting, because my read on the basic assumptions with which you approach life tends to label that as more left wing. And it's interesting how I see this modern phenomenon where the left tends to eat itself.
It's a weird world.
It tends to keep moving left and ostracize all of its moderates.
Yeah, there's no center anymore. It's very bizarre.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think a lot of people are in our position where they're just sort of political refugees. There's not like any particular flag that we feel like waving that identifies the nuance that is required to examine situations in their own context. And
I would say
crisis consists precisely of the fact that the old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born.
And in a time of that rebirth, I feel like I identify most as like a meritocrat, or I'm like, just bring me the best ideas. Like, I don't care where they come from. I don't care what the background is. I'm like, I want to know the ideas that are going to let us build something that is more functional and more humane than what was in the past.
Yeah, we have the choice to spread across the solar system and across the galaxy, or to stagnate here on Earth. And it's like whatever will keep us growing and expanding and becoming better, that's what I'm in favor of.
We have a conversation on Thursday that we're going to record with a degrowther, so that should be a really interesting. We'll probably put the conversations out.
I mean, he seems like he has a really, really promising take, regardless of his degrowth platform.
This is true.
It's very different, because I'm just bored to death of people coming around and giving these same talking points about overpopulation and there's an academic there's a popular academic narrative that's just getting old. So it's good to have your fresh perspective, and I think Simon Michaud on Thursday will be really interesting too, because I think he's coming at it from a totally different angle also, and it's based on technology too. Just to like preview that, he's definitely going for new sources of energy here on Earth. Small modular reactors, iron combustion. I think ammonia combustion, and also just trying to organize cities in a way that makes sense so they're energy efficient. So I don't think he's like so much a degrowther as he's just not thinking that we have to keep building more crap and that will solve the problems. Something like that. Or that the solution is just don't use engines, which is equally ridiculous. Right. So
Yes. Well, the solution to the energy crisis we had decades ago is build nuclear reactors.
Right, I know. What is going? What? I can't wrap my head around that one. I'm just like, guys, we know the answer.
Every time we have one of these conversations, Shiloh's like, I don't understand why nuclear isn't on the table.
Well, what my solution to this is that I propose that we that actually we don't necessarily need to build nuclear reactors. What we need to build is radiothermal steam generators.
Whoa,
See, what we do is we take these rocks that are mildly radioactive and we concentrate them in one place with some slight control rods to control how hot they get, and then we run water over them and run a steam turbine off this. So this is a radiothermal steam generator, which is much less scary than a nuclear reactor.
Simon had a cool idea too. He was like, hey, look, if you build these next to a mountain, you could just run the steam pipes up the mountain. They'll condense where it gets cold, and then you drip down and you have essentially desalinated water at the other end all of a sudden. And I think there's so many good ideas. That opens up this whole problem of why in the hell are we implementing these things? What is it that simple? It's just
Government.
isn't it
Regulation.
fear of that word nuclear to some extent too? Like you go to Berkeley today and there's these signs everywhere like proud.
Well, yes, but that
no
fear
nuclear.
manifests as government. That fear manifests as policy.
I have so many things to say about that. Let's do another one of these.
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay.
Okay, fantastic. Devon, it was a pleasure. I really appreciate you sending us your book.
Yeah,
And thank
everybody
you to
get the book,
Christine.
by the way.
Yeah, Theft of Fire.
Theft of Fire.
Yes,
It's available.
I think I will get the frowny face if I don't hold it up.
There you go.
Point.
Is there an audio version of this, by the way?
You're crowdsourcing it.
We are crowdsourcing it, and we are getting ready to launch the Kickstarter in possibly a week or two.
Hell yeah.
Cool.
So watch this space.
All
And
right.
I am so excited about that. I have found some phenomenal voice actors, and we're doing a full cast with different actors for each of the 3 major characters, and they are so good.
Cool.
That's going to be really cool.
All right, man. Yeah. Good luck with
thank
that. Look forward to seeing how it turns out.
And we'll see you again soon.
Yeah. Take care.